everybody. Our group here has been working on the comparison and contrast of concertos and sonatas and oratorios. And our process, very briefly, is this. We did a Google Doc document and we took all our composers and their works. So we each took one or two, and then we analyzed them according to a set of criteria. So the criteria would be like a genre, or the instrumentation, or the texture, the melody, harmony, rhythm, legacy, etc. And then we each took one criteria and we read it across, like a cross section, and we analyzed it accordingly. And so today you'll hear each of us talking this way, cross section wise, analyzing the pieces according to each criteria. There you go. Starting with?
Hi. So my criteria was genre, context, texture, and place. All of these styles were enjoyed during the Baroque era, and the chamber music was for small audiences, usually for the noble court. Concertos were for larger settings, larger audiences, like theater and orchestra. And oratorios were slightly different. They were more song and less theater. And we have an example. The first composer here is Elizabeth Claude Jacquet de la Grey, and she's from France in 1687. And her two pieces, Suite number 3 in A minor, for solo harpsichord, which was a lot of chamber music was for. And it stuck with the French style of simple yet elegant. And she also did fugue as well. And then we have the concerto, which is an example would be by Antonio Vivaldi. He's Italian, and his piece was Alla Rustica. And the concertos are usually 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. And then we have our composer Handel, and his orato is Messiah and the Glory of Lord, a chorus, and it was made in 1741. Texture here is 3 violins. It's also a 4-part chorus with soprano, alto, bass, and tenor. And if you go back to the Antonio Vivaldi, his is mostly polyphonic with triadic broken harmony. We also have the composer Corelli. It's also Italian. His piece, Trio Sonata Opus 3, is in 1689. And this wrote a lot of comfort music, and it was done for church. And last we have Bach. So he uses many of these different styles as well, but they're very dense. He's from Germany, and the 2 examples are the Prelude and Cello Suite number 1 and the Goldenberg Variations. Goldenberg is for solo keyboard, and it's polyphonic. The cello suite is also monophonic, but it is like an encyclopedia of creativity, which was unusual for their time. Thanks.
I'm going to be talking about instrumentation. So during the Baroque era, the harpsichord was a very common instrument, which was often used in a lot of musicians' works. We can hear its role in Corelli's Trio Sonata, Jacquet's Suite number 3 in A minor, both Prelude and Gigue, and Vivaldi's Concerto alla Rustica, and Bach's Aria Goldberg Variations. In these works, the harpsichord serves either as part of the basso continuo, providing harmonic support, such as Handel's and the Gloria of the Lord from Messiah, or as a solo instrument heard in Jacquet's Prelude and Gigue. However, there is one very notable piece that does not use the harpsichord, and that is Bach's Cello Suite number 1. Now I'll be talking about the harmonic progressions. So, despite their differences in instrumentation, all of these pieces share a very common feature. They all modulate, a fundamental thing in Baroque music. Corelli's Trio Sonata, opening 3, number 2, relies on the circle of fifths, modulating through its relative tonic and dominant keys and relative, minor keys. Bach's Cello Suite conveys the harmonic progressions through arpeggios and implied chords between tonic, dominant, and relative minor. Vivaldi's Concerto alla Rustica employs more dramatic modulations, often shifting abruptly between major and minor keys. So they all relatively modulate through the same way.
Hello, good people. Today I'll be going over the rhythmic elements of each piece, starting with Guerre. The fourth prelude contains 16th note values in common 4/4 time, whereas the movement after the fifth jig contains quarter notes with dotted rhythms 6/4 time. So they both take a pretty different rhythmic approach for each other. So next is a Sonata Opus 3, number 2, by composer Corelli, which has 4 movements. The first two, Grave and Allegro number 1, has a 4/4 time signature, whereas the third movement, Adagio, opts for a sophisticated time signature, 3/2. So then the last and final movement, Allegro number 2, it goes to 6/8 compound time signature. Every movement besides the first two have the same time signature. Some are more common, but others give more unique feel to each movement. On to Concerto alla Rustica by Antonio Vivaldi. The first part was very upbeat, 9/8 compound time signature with lots of triplets. The second part dials the tempo down quite a bit, and the time signature switches to 3/4. And unlike the first part, it contains quarter notes and plenty of eighth rests, and it follows with a 16th note at the end of each part, making it kind of repetitive. But once we make our way to part 3, we go to 2/4. It goes back to its roots from the first part with 8-note runs during passages, and it contains syncopated rhythms as well as connected notes. Now, let's take a trip back. Okay, this piece called Prelude comes from the cello suite, and it's number 1. Notations look absolutely ridiculous. However, it is just 16th notes with arpeggiated chords meant to be performed in a fluid legato-like manner. The time signature is simple. It's 4/4, so it's very common. So now, another one. Bach to Bach. Let's go. Aria. The first parts, we have a lot of 16th notes, dotted eighths, and a lot of opposing notations. The first part containing 3/4, a little less common, but still widely used. And the second part takes the numerator down a note to 2/4. And finally, 12/8. Think of 4/4's triplet brother. So a lot of takida as well. And really not much to be said here again. It keeps a very similar pattern just like the last two movements, but it adds some syncopation to it. And finally, And the Glory of the Lord from Messiah by Handel. With consistent 4/4 time, it has a variety of rhythmic patterns. Firstly, dotted notes with eighth notes, giving a syncopated feel to it, like others. And it has plenty of straightforward quarter notes and half notes as well. The rests aren't very much to touch on, just your simple 2Z quarter rests and your whole rests as well. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm going to be talking about melody. First off, we have a piece by Jacquette de la Guerre, the Prelude, and then also a Geek, both from Suite number 3. These two pieces, both are ornamented, both melodies are ornamented, but the first is scalic and using a fuller range, and then the second uses a much smaller range but jumps more in the melody, so it ends up seeming a little bit more chaotic. And then we listened to Corelli's Trio Sonata, and this again was a stepwise movement, but much more elegant and balanced than Jacquette de la Guerre. Then we listened to Vivaldi's Concerto in G alla Rustica. This melody was similar to the Geek in the first part, and then in the second part it was actually more similar to the Trio Sonata, so the melody was more elegant and balanced. And then we listened to Bach Cello Suite number 1, the Prelude. This was the introduction to the entire suite, and it included a sort of series of arpeggiated chords. The arpeggiated chords sort of create this sense of fluidity and was kind of similar to the arpeggiated chords in Vivaldi's Concerto. Then we listened to Bach's aria from the Goldberg Variations, and there are 3 variations. So the melody is quite different in all 3 variations, or at least it becomes a little bit more busy and chaotic as it goes along. So the first variation uses a sort of scalic motion like Jacquette's Prelude. The second variation and third variations move more in sequence towards arpeggiated movement, similar to Vivaldi's Concerto and Bach's Cello Suite. And it's like a dance-like, almost similar to the dance-like sections in Vivaldi's Concerto. Finally, we listened to Handel's Messiah, which we will play an excerpt from later on. Many of Handel's melodies, especially in the recitatives and arias, have scalic and stepwise motion, similar to before, but he uses more sort of leaps for dramatic effect. And he also uses counterpoint, which is similar to Bach. Okay, so I'll also be talking about some interesting facts about the different composers. So Jacquette de la Guerre was a woman and one of the few highly regarded in the French court at the time, which is pretty cool. Corelli worked for influential patrons such as Queen Christina of Sweden. Vivaldi was known as the Red Priest because of his red hair. And Bach, there's a lot to say about Bach. He was the greatest contrapuntist ever, maybe. He wrote in all genres except for opera. Of his 20 children, 4 of them became well-known composers. He came from a family with at least 7 generations of musicians, producing over 50 professional musicians. And he walked 400 kilometers to go and study under Dietrich Buxtehude in Lübeck in 1705. And Handel introduced Italian-style recitatives and arias into English choral music. Okay, thank you.
So hello everybody. After you've heard from my colleagues about all the different criteria, I'm going to be talking about the influence and the legacy of all these different composers and their compositions. And I'm going to be comparing and contrasting them, so look out for that. So starting with Jacquette de la Guerre, she was a woman, so that's like the first point of contrast. She's studied as a woman from the Baroque era, and her works are now studied in academic institutions, etc. So she's still alive, and she was also a good influence on future generations just after her. So just like that, Corelli also is studied today in institutions, and his work is subject of a voluminous critical bibliography, and his sonatas are still widely used in musical academies as didactic material. And his works influenced Vivaldi and Handel. So that was Corelli. Vivaldi, on the other hand, he was also influencing succeeding generations, but soon after his death in, I think, 1741, his works went under, or he went into obscurity. And it was only much later in the 20th century that there was a vigorous revival of his music. And his music was also, in the 20th century, was featured in many pieces, many plays and films. And I just have seen a film that I now recall had Vivaldi's music in it. And the film was Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. And Alla Rustica was played as kind of the leitmotif. It played several times in the film. And Alla Rustica is what is known as program music. And program music is music that is depicting the theme. It's like a text depiction. And I recall in the film that this was exactly what the music did. It was depicting the mood of the character in the film, who was actually a musical director and addicted to uppers, drugs. And every morning he saw his face and the music was playing and he was taking his drugs. So anyways, that was Vivaldi and Alla Rustica. And of course, thank goodness that there was a revival of Vivaldi. Vivaldi's work was also a great influence on Bach. So now going on to Bach, very much like Vivaldi, Bach too had a legacy, of course, had an influence on his peers and maybe a couple of generations after, but went under for the next 2 centuries. And in the 19th century, there was a revival of Bach's work. And then in the 20th century, so you know when you see those letters B, W, V, do you know what that stands for? That stands for, it's not a car, it's B for Bach, W for Werke, and V for Verzeichnis, which is like a catalog of all the 1,000 works of Bach. And that was done in 1950. So there was an enormous revival of Bach. The cello suites were the same thing. They kind of went under, and then there was a revival of the cello suites, and today they're pretty much a cornerstone of any cello repertoire, and again used several times in several productions, musical productions, etc. The Goldberg variations also had a revival, and of course our Canadian pianist Glenn Gould has played them and popularized them in the 20th century. And then finally, we'll talk about Handel. Much unlike Vivaldi and Bach, Handel's music was always continuously present right from after his death to now. And of course, his Messiah is played every Christmas, as we know. And the Messiah has a very big tradition of giving to charity, because when Handel wrote this work, he wrote it for a hospital foundation. And that tradition is carried on, and it continues to this day as a piece that is instrumental, no pun intended, for charity. So that was Handel. And also Handel is very much revered in choirs, and in any amateur choir, you know, Handel's Messiah is very, very popular. So that was my comparison and contrast of the legacy and the influence of these composers and their works. Thank you.
So you One, two.
Oh God, thank you.